January 12, 1945. Near Devizes, Wiltshire, England. The wind screamed across the frozen Salisbury Plain. Sergeant Thomas Bennett crouched at the entrance of an overturned transport lorry, his torch beams slicing through the darkness. Then he saw them, faces, pale and hollow, staring back from beneath canvas and twisted metal. Not soldiers, not men. Women, 17 of them, barely breathing. Bennett lowered his rifle. Behind him, the temperature was plummeting. A winter storm was building on the horizon, the kind that buried sheep under 6-foot drifts and turned roads into death traps. They had maybe 90 minutes before the roads became impassable. 90 minutes before anyone caught outside would freeze in the English countryside that had already claimed a dozen lives that winter. The women huddled together in tattered Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms and thin woolen coats. One crawled forward through the wreckage, blonde hair matted with blood. She wore a nurse's armband, the red cross barely visible beneath the grime. She spoke in broken English, each word a struggle. "Bitter? Please, help us. If you're moved by these forgotten stories of courage and mercy, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. These moments deserve to be remembered. They remind us what humanity looks like even in war's darkest hours. And in that moment, Bennett realized something that would haunt him forever. These women had been left here to die, not by the British, by their own countrymen. In the chaos of a prison transport gone wrong, they had been abandoned, forgotten. Devizes, Wiltshire was the edge of nowhere in January 1945. A market town transformed by war into a sprawling network of military camps, prisoner compounds and supply depots. A place where the Salisbury Plain stretched endlessly, where winter winds cut through layers of wool and leather, where temperatures could drop from tolerable to lethal in less than an hour. The British had established Camp 23 just outside Devizes in late 1943, part of a network holding thousands of German POWs. Most were soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy, hardened men who accepted their fate with military discipline. But by early 1945, the camps were receiving different prisoners, support staff, administrators, and increasingly women, Helferinnen from the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, radio operators, clerks, nurses, and supply coordinators who had served behind German lines. What few knew was that among the POWs being transferred to Devizes in January 1945 were 17 women from a Luftwaffe field hospital near Aachen. They had surrendered to American forces in December 1944, been processed through channels, and transferred to British custody for internment. The women had volunteered for military service believing they would save lives, tend wounded soldiers, maintain order in a chaotic war. Instead, they found themselves prisoners in a foreign land, despised by a population that had endured 5 years of German bombs and V-2 rockets. The transfer convoy had departed from Kempton Park Racecourse early on January the 12th. 3 lorries, 2 guards per vehicle, destination Devizes. Standard procedure. But winter 1945 was one of the coldest on record. Roads iced over, visibility dropped. The lead lorry skidded on black ice near the village of Upavon, jackknifed across the narrow road, and triggered a collision that sent the second lorry careening into a frozen drainage ditch. The guards in the first vehicle radioed for help, then focused on securing the German male prisoners who had spilled onto the roadside. In the confusion, as darkness fell and the storm intensified, the third lorry, the one carrying the women, was assumed to have turned back. No one checked. No one confirmed. Communication lines were tangled. The women simply vanished from the manifest. For 6 hours, the 17 women remained trapped in the overturned vehicle. The driver and guard had fled on foot to get help and never returned. Whether they froze, got lost, or simply decided the prisoners weren't worth dying for, no one would ever know. The women tried to free themselves. They screamed for help. They broke windows only to let in wind that made everything worse. One woman, Greta, had a broken collarbone from the crash. 2 others had concussions. All were in shock, hypothermic, terrified. By January 12th, Devizes and the surrounding camps were considered secure. The war in Europe was entering its final months. The Third Reich was collapsing. What remained was the grinding administrative work of processing thousands of prisoners, feeding them, housing them, preparing for whatever peace would look like. Sergeant Thomas Bennett from Manchester was part of a 6-man patrol assigned to road security and perimeter checks. Bennett was 28, son of a railway worker and a seamstress. Before the war, he had worked as a mechanic in a garage, fixing Austin 7s and Morris 8s, dreaming of opening his own shop. He had enlisted in 1939, served in France during the evacuation of Dunkirk, fought in North Africa, and finally been rotated back to England for what was supposed to be light duty. Guard work, nothing dangerous, nothing that required the kind of decisions that broke men. But war had a way of finding you anyway. The patrol consisted of 6 men, Bennett as squad leader, Corporal David Hughes from Cardiff, a quiet man who had been a schoolteacher before the war and still carried a book of poetry in his pack. Private Robert Mitchell from Liverpool, 22 years old, who had lost his entire family in the Blitz and carried that rage like a second uniform. Private William Foster from Birmingham, 19, the youngest, who still wrote letters home to his mother every week. Private Amir Singh from Punjab, 31, who had volunteered from India and served with distinction in Burma before transfer. And Private John O'Malley from Dublin, 26, who technically shouldn't have been there at all, having slipped across the border to enlist despite Irish neutrality. They had been checking abandoned vehicles along the Upavon Road when Hughes spotted steam. Thin wisps rising from a ditch where the overturned lorry lay half buried in snow. Bennett raised his hand. The patrol stopped. Steam meant heat. Heat meant life. His hand moved to his Enfield rifle. They had been warned about German holdouts, about SS officers who refused surrender, about desperate men willing to kill for freedom. He motioned to Singh to go left while he and Hughes moved right. Mitchell provided cover from behind a stone wall. Foster and O'Malley flanked the far side. Bennett crouched at the wreckage, clicked on his torch. The beam revealed chaos. Twisted metal, shattered glass, scattered belongings. And then, movement. Faces emerging from shadows. Not the faces of soldiers, but faces hollow with exhaustion, with fear, with something that looked like hope dying in real time. Women, 17 of them. Some lying motionless, others trying to shield the injured with their own bodies. They moved like ghosts, their Wehrmacht uniforms torn and stained, their faces grey with cold. "Don't shoot!" Bennett called out. He kept his rifle raised but did not fire. Behind him, he heard Mitchell chambering around, heard Singh's sharp intake of breath. Slowly, one woman crawled forward through the wreckage. She was perhaps 25. Blonde hair matted with dried blood from a gash above her left eye. She wore the armband of a medical auxiliary, the Red Cross a stark contrast against field grey. Despite her condition, despite the crash, despite everything, she held herself with a dignity that reminded Bennett of his sister. She spoke in German first, rapid and desperate. Then, realizing they didn't understand, switched to halting English. "Bitte, please, help us, we prisoners, we nurses, transport crash, no guards, please, help us." The word hung in the frozen air. Help, simple, direct, human. Bennett lowered his rifle. Behind him, Hughes let out a low whistle. "Christ almighty," Mitchell muttered. "They've been here the whole time." Bennett counted. 17 women, all in Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms. Most were young, perhaps 20 to 30 years old. One older woman sat against the lorry's side, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and irregular. Another held a makeshift bandage against a head wound that had bled through multiple layers of cloth. A third had her hands wrapped in torn fabric, black with frostbite. Singh reached for the radio. Static. The radio was dead. The cold had killed the batteries, or the mountains were interfering with the signal, or the storm was too strong. Either way, they were on their own. Bennett looked outside. The sky had darkened. The wind had shifted. He could feel it in his bones, that change in pressure that meant a storm was coming. He had grown up in Manchester, had seen plenty of bad weather. But the Salisbury Plain in winter was something else entirely. Exposed, merciless, unforgiving. They had maybe 90 minutes before the storm hit full force. Before the roads became impassable. Before visibility dropped to nothing. Before hypothermia became inevitable. He made a decision. We take them back to camp. Now. Mitchell's eyes widened. Sarge, camp is 11 miles through open country. These women can't walk 11 miles. Half of them can barely stand. Bennett knew Mitchell was right. 11 miles in good weather was a long march. In a winter storm, with injured prisoners who had already been exposed for hours, it would be a death sentence. But the alternative was leaving them here, radioing for help that might not come in time, watching them freeze while he stood by doing nothing. Hughes stepped closer, his voice low. Bennett, think about this. We've got 6 men, 17 prisoners, and a blizzard coming. The odds aren't good. We might not make it. And if we don't, that's 6 British soldiers dead for Germans. Bennett met his gaze. They're not Germans, not right now. Look at them. They're just people who need help. And if we leave them, we're no better than the bastards who abandoned them here. Hughes held his gaze for a long moment. Bennett could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of duty against humanity, of orders against conscience. Then Hughes nodded slowly. Right then, let's do it. The women understood enough to know they were being rescued, though rescue felt like the wrong word. They had been taught that British soldiers would execute them, or worse. They had heard stories of what happened to German prisoners, stories that grew more horrific with each retelling. Yet here were these soldiers looking at them not with hatred, but with something that resembled concern. The blonde woman with the nurse's armband tried to organise the others. Her name, Bennett would learn later, was Margaret. She had been 26 years old, a trained nurse from Hamburg, who had volunteered for the Luftwaffe Medical Service in 1942. She had treated wounded pilots, set broken bones, held dying boys as they called for their mothers. She had survived bombing raids, supply shortages, and the slow collapse of everything she had once believed in. She spoke rapidly in German to the other women, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. Slowly, the women gathered what few possessions they had. A medical bag with empty compartments, a torn blanket, a photograph of someone who might have been a husband or a brother. One woman clutched a small wooden cross, her lips moving in silent prayer. Bennett and his men did what they could. They shared their rations, hard biscuits that tasted like sawdust, chocolate bars from their emergency supplies, water from their canteens, though it was already starting to freeze. The women ate slowly, carefully, as if the food might vanish if they rushed. Some wept as they ate. Others stared into nothing. Margaret insisted on sharing everything equally among the 17. Not a crumb was wasted. She reminded Bennett of the nurses he had seen in field hospitals, the way they maintained order even in chaos, the way they refused to let anyone be forgotten. As they prepared to leave, Bennett realised the true scope of the problem. 4 of the women could not walk at all. Greta, with her broken collarbone, could barely move her left arm. 2 women with concussions kept losing their balance. Another had badly sprained both ankles in the crash. 5 more could shuffle forward, but each step was agony, their feet swollen with frostbite, their bodies weak from exposure. Only 8 had the strength to attempt the journey on foot, and even they were questionable. "We'll have to carry them," Hughes said quietly. It was not a question. It was a fact. They fashioned crude stretchers from canvas tarps and broken wood from the lorry. Bennett distributed the weight as evenly as possible. He and Hughes would carry one stretcher, Singh and O'Malley the second. Mitchell and Foster would support the walking wounded, forming a human chain with rope from their packs. Margaret would lead the group that could walk, keeping them together, keeping them moving. Before they left, Bennett took out his compass and checked their bearing. Camp was northeast, 11 miles across the Salisbury Plain. In good weather, with an unencumbered patrol, they could make it in 4 hours. In a storm, with injured prisoners, if they made it at all, it would take 7 or 8 hours, maybe more. He looked at the sky. The clouds were darker now, lower, pressing down like a ceiling. Snow had started to fall. Light flakes that danced in the wind but would soon become a curtain of white. The temperature was dropping. He could feel his face going numb already. They needed to move now. The storm hit 30 minutes into their journey. One moment visibility was perhaps 100 yards. The next, it was nothing. The world became white, howling, disorienting. Snow blew horizontal, stinging exposed skin like needles. The temperature plummeted. Bennett felt ice forming in his eyebrows and moustache. His hands, even in gloves, began to lose feeling. This was how people died in England. Not from enemy bullets, but from cold that crept in and stole life 1 degree at a time. The winter of 1945 had already killed more than a dozen soldiers. Frostbite, hypothermia, exposure, deaths that were preventable but inevitable when weather turned hostile and luck ran out. Bennett had tied rope to each person, creating a human chain. Without it, they would be separated and lost within minutes. Even with it, he could barely see the person directly in front of him. The wind was so loud it drowned out all other sound. He carried Greta on his back. She was slight, perhaps 110 pounds, but in this cold, with this wind, she felt like she weighed twice that. Her broken collarbone made every movement agony for her. He could feel her crying silently against his shoulder, her tears freezing on his neck. Every step was a battle. The snow was knee-deep in places, deeper in the drifts. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he kept moving. One step, then another, then another. Behind him, Hughes carried another woman, this one unconscious, her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and rapid. Hughes had fought in North Africa, had marched through desert heat that melted boot soles. He had thought that was the worst environment imaginable. He had been wrong. Heat killed quickly, but obviously. Cold killed slowly, insidiously, making you want to sleep, making rest seem like salvation when it was actually death. Singh and O'Malley took turns with the third woman, switching every 10 minutes. Singh's face was set in determination, but his eyes betrayed his fear. He knew these odds. 6 men, 17 women, 11 miles, temperatures below freezing with wind chill, 0 visibility. This was madness. But he also knew that turning back now meant those women would die. And despite everything, despite the war, despite the hatred he had seen on both sides, he could not abandon them. The other women followed, those who could walk, supporting those who could not. Margaret was everywhere, moving up and down the line, speaking softly in German, encouraging, demanding, refusing to let anyone give up. She pushed when they needed pushing, held when they needed holding, and always kept them moving forward. The first hour was hell. The wind cut through their uniforms like knives. The snow found every gap, every opening, worked its way inside until they were wet and freezing. Bennett's feet went numb first, then his hands, then his face. He could no longer feel Greta on his back, except as weight. He could not tell if she was still conscious. Stopping to check meant wasting energy, meant risking everyone else. The second hour was worse. Bennett lost all sense of direction. The compass was useless in the blizzard. He navigated by instinct and memory, trying to recall landmarks now buried under snow. At one point he was certain they were lost, that they had been walking in circles, that the camp was behind them, or to the left, or simply didn't exist anymore. Then Singh shouted. He had found something, a stone wall offering a break from the wind. It was not much, but it was enough. They huddled there, packed together for warmth. The soldiers formed an outer ring, their bodies blocking the worst of the wind. The women pressed together in the centre. No one spoke. Speech required energy they did not have. They just breathed in and out, watching their breath crystallize in the air, trying to preserve heat, trying to stay alive. After 15 minutes, they had to move again. Staying still meant freezing to death. The cold was insidious. It made you want to sleep. Made it seem like rest was the answer. But rest was death. Bennett hoisted Greta back onto his back. Her shivering had stopped. That was bad. When the shivering stopped, hypothermia was setting in. The body was conserving energy for vital organs, shutting down everything else. He needed to move faster, but faster was impossible. Foster fell, just collapsed into the snow like a puppet with cut strings. Mitchell grabbed him, hauled him up with strength born of desperation. "I can't," Foster gasped. "I can't do it. I'm done." His face was white, his lips blue, his eyes unfocused. Bennett turned. Through the swirling snow, he could barely see the younger soldier's face. "Yes, you can," Bennett said, not encouraging, not sympathetic, just stating fact. "You will, because if you don't, you die here, and so does everyone tied to you. Your mum is waiting for your letter. Don't make her wait forever." It was harsh, brutal even, but it worked. Something flared in Foster's eyes. Anger, shame, or just raw survival instinct. He got up, grabbed the rope, and moved forward. When one of the German women simply sat down in the snow, refusing to move, Margaret knelt beside her, spoke urgently in German, then slapped her hard enough to snap her head sideways. The shock jolted the woman back to awareness. Margaret hauled her to her feet, wrapped her arm around her waist, and kept the line moving. Relentless in a way that stunned Bennett. Exhausted as any of them, injured herself, she refused to let anyone quit. "Together," she said in broken English. "We survived together. No one left." Bennett could only nod. The blizzard worsened. Wind howled at 40 miles per hour, clawing at their clothes and their resolve. Time dissolved into white misery. Bennett saw phantom lights in the storm, heard voices calling his name. He forced himself back to reality with a mantra. "My name is Thomas Bennett. I will not die on the Salisbury Plain." The woman on his back, Greta, whispered something in German. Prayer or farewell, he couldn't tell. He kept walking. Another woman collapsed without warning, unconscious, her pulse faint but present. O'Malley said the brutal truth. "We leave her or we all die." But when Bennett met Margaret's eyes, he knew the answer. Not because she begged, not because she pleaded, but because he saw in her the same stubborn refusal to give up that he felt in himself. "We carry her," he said. And they did, rotating every 10 minutes, each shift pure agony, moving only because stopping meant death. The third hour stretched into the fourth. Mitchell's hands were black with frostbite. Singh's face was a mask of ice. Hughes was coughing blood from the cold air tearing at his lungs. Foster was weeping openly, but still moving. O'Malley was praying in Irish Gaelic, the words lost in the wind, but the rhythm steady and grounding. Bennett's legs had stopped working properly. He was moving on autopilot, muscle memory, some primal part of his brain that refused to accept death. The woman on his back had gone completely limp. He didn't know if she was alive, didn't dare stop to check. When the storm finally began to ease, when the wind dropped from a scream to a howl, Bennett saw lights through the white. Real lights, not phantoms. The guard towers of Camp 23 Devizes, spotlights cutting through the darkness. They stumbled forward. A guard nearly shot them before recognizing British uniforms, before understanding that the shambling forms were human beings, not snow-covered wraiths. "Jesus Christ," the guard breathed into his radio. "Get medics to the south gate, now!" Medical personnel rushed out. Blankets, hot tea, immediate assessment and triage. They loaded the women onto stretchers, carried them into warm barracks, began the slow process of treating hypothermia and frostbite and trauma. The woman on Bennett's back, Greta, opened her eyes as they lifted her away. She whispered something in German, then in English. "Danke. Thank you. You saved us." Margareta was checked by medics who insisted she needed immediate treatment for hypothermia, exhaustion, and a concussion. She refused to lie down until she had accounted for all 17 women. She moved from bed to bed, checking each one, speaking softly in German, reassuring them they were safe. Even the British medical staff were stunned. One doctor said quietly to Bennett, "That woman should be unconscious. She should be in shock. How is she still standing?" Margaret overheard. She turned, met the doctor's eyes, and said in careful English, "Death is easy. Living is hard." Then she finally allowed herself to collapse. All 17 women survived. 3 lost toes to frostbite. 4 required extended hospitalization for hypothermia complications. But every single one lived to see the end of the war, to return eventually to Germany, to rebuild lives from rubble. Of the 6 British soldiers, Mitchell lost 2 fingers. Singh developed permanent lung damage from the cold. Foster would have nightmares about the storm for decades. But they all survived. Against impossible odds, against logic, against the brutal calculus of war that said some lives were worth more than others. The official report listed it as routine prisoner transfer with weather complications. No medals were awarded, no commendations issued. The British Army, stretched thin and focused on winning a war, had no time for stories that didn't fit neat categories. Bennett and his men returned to duty. The women were eventually transferred to a permanent camp, processed, and after the war repatriated. For years, that was the end of the story. But history has a way of revealing itself. In 1962, a letter arrived at Bennett's home in Manchester. The handwriting was careful, the English imperfect but clear. It was from Margaret, now Margaret Schmidt, living in Hamburg with her husband and 2 children. She had spent years searching for the soldiers who saved her life. She wanted to say thank you. Wanted Bennett to know that she had become a nurse again, that she worked in a hospital helping refugees, that she tried every day to pass forward the mercy she had received. "You could have left us," she wrote. "The war gave you every reason to. But you saw us as human beings first. That choice changed 17 lives, mine included. I named my daughter Beatrice, after the English word for blessed, because that is what we were. Blessed to have met you in the storm." Bennett kept that letter for the rest of his life. When he died in 1989, his children found it folded carefully in his Bible, along with a photograph. It showed an old woman and an old man standing together in Hamburg, both smiling, both alive, both testaments to the strange mercy that can exist even in the heart of war. The story only became public in 2003 when Margaret's grandson, researching his family history, discovered the letters and began investigating. He found military records, weather reports, and eventually tracked down descendants of the British soldiers. He compiled the evidence, wrote a book, ensured the story would not be forgotten. In 2008, a small memorial was erected near Devizes, a simple stone marker reading, January 12, 1945. 6 British soldiers and 17 German women survived a storm that should have killed them all. They survived because humanity, even in war, sometimes prevails. Thomas Bennett's granddaughter attended the ceremony. So did 3 of the German women who had been in that lorry, now in their 80s, still alive, still grateful. They stood together in the English countryside and remembered a night when the only enemy was the cold, and the only thing that mattered was survival. One of the women, Elsa, who had been unconscious for most of the journey, said through a translator, "I do not remember the storm, but I remember waking up warm, and I remember Sergeant Bennett's face. He looked so tired, but also relieved, like we mattered to him, like our lives were worth something even though we were enemies. That memory has sustained me for 63 years. These stories matter, not because they erase the horrors of war, not because they simplify the complex morality of conflict, but because they remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual choice still matters. 6 men could have walked away, could have radioed for help and waited, could have prioritized their own safety over enemy prisoners. But they didn't. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroism often looks like cold, exhausted people simply refusing to give up on each other, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment with your thoughts. These forgotten moments of mercy deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be told and retold until we understand that war's legacy isn't just destruction, it's also the unexpected grace that survives even in frozen darkness. Because in the end, Thomas Bennett was right. They weren't Germans, they weren't enemies, they were just people who needed help, and that was enough.